Good afternoon. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? Well, I'd like to welcome you all here to our law school. I'm Shirley Jefferson. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Affairs and Diversity. And I am very proud and honored today to stand before you and celebrate the life of a great man that I had an opportunity to meet. So thank you all for coming. We have a nice program for all of us. But in the meanwhile, in life there's always sadness. Within the last month or so, we lost two professors, and they both were freedom fighters. One was Professor Gil Kojovic, who was my mentor, who taught here over 30-some years ago. Also, Professor Alex Banks. Both of them were freedom fighters for social justice and civil rights. And they always looked out for underrepresented members of the society, and they all gave their life to fight injustice. I dedicate this program to both of those professors today, and I would just like for us to take a short moment of silence. If we could please just bow our heads, and if you knew them, just remember them. If you didn't, just send good wishes their way. Okay, thank you. We're gonna sing, as some people will call it, the Negro Anthony. Lift every voice and sing. We have the words in your program. If you could please stand. And I have a few members of our law school will come up and lead us in that song.
Welcome, and thank you very much. Thank you in particular the members of our choir, and welcome here to Vermont Law School. My name is Tom McHenry. I'm the Dean and President of the school, and it is a great pleasure for me to celebrate my first Martin Luther King birthday here at Vermont Law School. Dr. King was born on January 15th of 1929, and he was assassinated on April 4th of 1968 at the tender age of 40. He would be 88 years old today. And I'll mention just a moment a little bit of a connection on that time period. I'd like to particularly welcome some of our guests today. I think we have a group from South Royalton High School. Maybe you'd raise your hands. Wow. Thank you so much for being here. I heard there might be a quiz later in the day. I did learn a good statistic for your high school students today. The Gallup organization has been hired by the American Association of Law Schools to survey why people go to law school and when they decide. And it turns out that of those going to law school, 54% of them, so more than half, have made the decision before they go to college. So among you, you probably already know whether you're going to law school. And if you are thinking of it, come over and see us. We'll talk to you about it. I think we also have a number of faculty in the room. Please raise your hands. Good. A number of staff. Please raise your hands. There we go. Oh, great. You might be outnumbering our faculty. We have some alums in the room, some alumni. Raise your hands. Great. There we go. And some other visitors to the school. Raise your hand if you're just visiting today. Great. Well, welcome to have you. Terrific, we have two there. Anybody who's not sure why they're here, raise their hand. Oh, there we go, okay, we have at least one, all right. My remarks will be immensely brief, fortunately, because we have a wonderful speaker and our professor, Rebecca Zitlow, who will be speaking to you. I just wanted to mention two very distant but personal connections. Unlike Dean Jefferson, I never had the pleasure of meeting Dr. King, but one of the things you should know, if you're not that familiar with American history, is it wasn't really until the 1960s that the promises of the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery and the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution requiring equal protection were brought to bear in all parts of our country, and arguably we are still trying to live up to that promise. My father was a lawyer in New York City, and he took the large portion of the summer of 1964 to go to the South and represent young people, mostly college students, who were signing up black voters for the first time to allow them to have voting rights. And there were often trumped up charges to prevent them from being able to register to vote. And I understand, although he doesn't talk about it, that he was beaten up in a courtroom in Mississippi by a couple of local rednecks. And if you know my father, I can tell you that he got in a few good punches. So I have that connection. That was the summer, by the way, that our family spent the summer in Vermont of 1964 because some friends lent us their house up in Warren, Vermont, and that was my first real experience with the state of Vermont. So it must have stayed with me. Also, a couple of years later, in either 1966 or 67, I wasn't able to determine, and I don't remember because I was only about 12 or 13 years old, Dr. King spoke in Sheep's Meadow in Central Park, which is the large open area. In fact, it's also a place where you'll hear a Paul Simon song later in the program, where Simon and Garfunkel played a couple of memorable concerts. So many people came to hear Dr. King speak that day that we weren't able to get to the Meadow, and sound systems were not as good back then. So I never actually heard Dr. King speak, but I was there in Central Park when he was the speaker. And there were so many people at the time who deeply believed in his vision and were motivated by his vision, that it was a moving time. It was a moving time for America. It was a moving time for me. And I hope that the promises of the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment are something that we as lawyers can do. So I'm particularly pleased that we at Vermont Law School, as a law school, are hosting this celebration today, because it is often only through the work of the law that we can guarantee that the Constitution of our country is applied to all citizens, regardless of their color. So I thank you very much, and I will turn it over to Dean Jefferson to lead us again in our next musical selection. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean McHenry. Our next item on the program will be a musical selection by Emma Akrawi, accompanied by Will. Then we will have The Occasion by Rashida Butler, the president of the Black Law Student Association.
God's gonna trouble the water. Who's that yonder dressed in red? Wade in the water. Must be the children that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Yeah. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Yeah. Who's that yonder dressed in white? Wade in the water. Must be the children of the Israelite. Oh, God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Who's that young dressed in blue? Wade in the water. Must be the children that's coming through. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Yeah. You don't believe I've been redeemed. Wade in the water.
Everyone, please give Emma and Will another round of applause. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. More than 3 decades have passed since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday became a national holiday across America. We are here today to celebrate the drum major for peace. Today, more than ever, is a time to remember the dream Dr. King had for this nation and renewing that dream. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did, let us not shy away from, but embrace the piercing dissonance of dishonest, frank, and vital debate. Furthermore, let us reject the empty rhetoric of anyone who would engage in cynical attempts to divide and cast blame. You can choose instead to affirm once more that Americans from all backgrounds and perspectives must come together to be a part of a positive change. This is what Dr. King stood for. As a nation of laws and high ideals, we have always had the power to forge our own futures. Dr. King's example offers inspiring proof of this fact. And as our present work in law or policy unfolds, I am confident where forging our own futures will take us. I would like to leave you with these words from Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. I say to you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation would rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. While we are here at VLS, let's spend our time working together, building together, rising together. We must recommit ourselves to fighting for the causes that define Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and work, among them voting rights, police and community relations, in our criminal justice system. Let us continue Martin Luther King Jr.'s fight to ensure freedom and justice for all. So, I implore all of you to follow the steps of King and live up to Vermont Law School's motto, Lex pro ubre et obre, law for the community and the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashida. You know, we've tried to incorporate a lot of things that I grew up with in Selma. We used to have mass meetings where we would meet Dr. King and we would talk about what we were gonna be doing, strategizing, but that was always singing. Singing would always uplift us. We just heard Wave in the Water. We're gonna hear next Bridge Over Troubled Water. It's a lot of water up in here. But you know, the slaves, they had to come through a lot of water. You know, you might have a lot of water sometimes, meaning tears, but the sun will shine. So without delay, Aria King, one of our master students, she will sing Bridge Over Troubled Water. Then we will have Professor Robert Sand. He will introduce our guest speaker. So just in that order. Okay.
when times get rough and friends just can't be found, like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down. When you're down and out and you're on the street, when evening falls so hard, I will comfort you, and I'll take your part when darkness comes and pain is all around, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down. Sail on, silver girl. Sail on by. Your time has come to shine. Your dreams are on their way. See how they shine when you need a friend. I'm standing right behind, like a bridge over troubled water. I will ease your mind, like a bridge over troubled water. I will ease your mind, like a bridge over troubled water. I will ease your mind. Thank you.
Feels like that needs another round of applause. That was amazing. I will not be singing my introduction. At a time of often bleak and distressing national and international news, it is always energizing to see the scores of people at VLS tirelessly committed to the cause of justice. And this is true for students, staff, and faculty. But we are also fortunate, we are also blessed to work in a community of scholars who understand and appreciate the critical importance of looking back, of taking an historical view of how we got here. Understanding our history can inform our future. Learning about historical reformers from scholars helps us appreciate on whose shoulders we stand today. Rebecca Zitlow is such a scholar. She's a national expert on the post-Civil War Reconstruction era and brings to life in her most recent book an unsung hero of the Reconstruction Congress, James Ashley from Ohio. Professor Zitlow writes in the prologue of her book, The Forgotten Emancipator, quote, "However, my interest in the Reconstruction era is not only historical. Although Reconstruction occurred 150 years ago, this crucial era of constitutional development still resonates in the United States today. In many ways, our nation still has not resolved the conflicts that characterized that era," close quote. Rebecca Zitlow is a professor of law and values at the University of Toledo College of Law. She's a graduate of Yale Law School and Barnard College. We are very fortunate at VLS to have her with us as a visiting professor for the year. As we celebrate and honor Dr. King, it is my pleasure to present to you Professor Rebecca Zitlow.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here today to have a chance to speak to all of you. Last year, I had the pleasure of attending this celebration, and that's when I realized what a special place Vermont Law School really is. So to actually be part of it this year is just really, really amazing, and I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak, Dean Jefferson. In his most famous speech at the 1963 March on Washington, which Rashida quoted earlier, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebrated the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Reconstruction era, and lamented the lack of progress since then. Said Dr. King, 100 years later, the Negro is still not free, still badly crippled by the manacle of segregation and chains of discrimination, and still lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. King argued that the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution was a promise that all men, black and white, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The question before us today is how to enforce that promise. How do we, as law students, lawyers, all people who are interested in the cause of justice and equality, act to bring this promise about? In law school, students learn about the value of civil rights litigation to enforce constitutional rights. The NAACP legal defense team and other civil rights lawyers filed lawsuits to enforce the 14th Amendment and achieved important legal rulings to advance the cause of civil rights. For example, in the iconic case of Brown versus Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court held that racially segregated schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This ruling brought about the legal end of state-mandated segregation. But the Brown ruling did not become truly law until the activism of Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists. Dr. King and the activists who worked with him had similar goals, but a different plan to achieve them: enforce rights through political activism, what Dr. King referred to as the fierce urgency of now, to make real the promise of democracy. At the 1963 March, King called for Congress to enact anti-discrimination legislation. King and his followers also fought for voting rights, to enable Blacks and civil rights advocates to engage in political activism. But perhaps most importantly, Dr. King and other civil rights activists engaged in direct action. The Montgomery bus boycott, freedom riders to integrate public transportation, public demonstrations in Birmingham, Selma, Chicago. Court rulings are important because they establish legal principles. But rights, including constitutional rights, do not become real in our nation unless they are backed up by political action. In my books, Enforcing Equality and The Forgotten Emancipator, I tell the story of political activists who have fought for freedom and equality throughout the history of our nation, starting with the anti-slavery and labor movements in the early 19th century, embraced and embodied into law by the Reconstruction Congress after the Civil War, advocated by the labor movement in the early 20th century, embodied into law by the New Deal Congress, and of course, the civil rights movement, in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. played such a crucial role. My books describe how political movements engage in popular constitutionalism, constitutional interpretation outside of the courts, when advocating rights claims. Political action influences lawmakers who invoke the claims of the activists when enacting legislation defining and protecting equality rights. Political activists also influence courts to rule in favor of civil rights litigants and uphold legislation protecting rights. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about the history of that activism and how Dr. King's legacy fits with the legacy of thousands of others, advocates for equality rights throughout the history of our country. This history teaches us an important lesson. To enforce equality, litigation alone is important, is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We must all seize the fierce urgency of now to make real the promise of democracy. The story of political activists enforcing equality rights goes back to the earliest days of our nation, the anti-slavery movement. As you know, and I bet you high school kids already know, all know this, our nation was formed of a combination of slave states and non-slave states. In the earliest days of our republic, most northern states banned slavery. Foremost amongst those was our own state of Vermont, the first to ban slavery in our state constitution. Many opponents of slavery hoped and believed that slavery would simply die out in our nation with industrialization. But the invention of the cotton gin revitalized Southern agriculture and the slavery that it depended on. In the 19th century, slavery grew, as did the anti-slavery movement. Abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison argued that slavery should be abolished because it was immoral and inhumane. Garrison argued that the Constitution was a covenant with death and an agreement in hell because it sanctioned slavery. However, Garrison refused to involve himself in politics because he believed that the entire United States government and laws were tainted by slavery. But other opponents of slavery thought it necessary to engage in political action in order to end it. The political anti-slavery movement adopted a doctrine of anti-slavery constitutionalism. Activists such as Frederick Douglass and Theodore Dwight Weld, pictured here, elaborated a theory of individual rights based on their interpretation of the Constitution as an anti-slavery document. Their theories included the right to equal protection, a broad view of citizenship rights for free Blacks. They argued that slavery violated the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment because it deprived slaves of liberty without due process of law. They claimed that slavery violated the right to equality and liberty recognized by the Declaration of Independence and enforceable through the preamble's promise of liberty. At the same time, industrialization brought about the nascent Northern labor movement. Northern industrial workers, such as the Lowell factory workers in the Lowell mills of Massachusetts argued that they were being subjected to wage slavery, forced to work long hours under inhumane conditions. There were many tensions between the abolitionists and the Northern labor movement, but some leaders of labor joined with anti-slavery activists. They saw a commonality with slaves who were also workers, and they argued that abolishing slavery was essential to protect the right of all workers against exploitation. Hundreds of workers at the Lowell mills signed anti-slavery petitions and engaged in anti-slavery activism. These workers were also instrumental in the formation of the Free Soil, Free Labor Party, which was the precursor to the anti-slavery Republican Party. And the theories of the rights of the free persons developed by the anti-slavery constitutionalists and the labor movement influenced leaders of the Reconstruction Congress, including James Ashley, the subject of my book. James Ashley was a member of Congress from Northwest Ohio from 1858 to 1868. Staunchly anti-slavery from the time he was a boy, Ashley dedicated his life to ending slavery and establishing rights for freed slaves and United States workers. Ashley was instrumental in the founding of the Republican Party. He was an outspoken advocate of not only against slavery, but in favor of rights of free blacks, including, and what he thought most important, the right to vote, in favor of workers' rights throughout the country, indeed throughout the world, advocating not only for the rights of slaves, but for the rights of Chinese coolies who were brought into this country as indentured servants and practically slave laborers. And at the side of President Abraham Lincoln, Ashley led the fight for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery in the United States House of Representatives. Catalysts for Action was another group of activists who aren't as well recognized, and those were the fugitive slaves themselves. Fugitive slaves asserted their own rights claims, defying all odds and certain punishment, if not death, if they were captured. Fugitive slaves escaped to northern states, including Vermont, where they could live a free life. Some sued in court for their freedom, and surprisingly, some actually won those lawsuits. But mostly fugitive slaves had to hide from slave catchers under constant threat of capture, as were free blacks who lived especially in border states such as Ohio and Pennsylvania, always in danger of being mistaken as fugitive slaves and being captured and sent back into slavery for the first time. Tensions mounted between northern states such as Vermont and Ohio, who wanted to protect fugitive slaves, and southern states who insisted that they had the right to return fugitive slaves and referred to the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution. Disputes over fugitive slaves were one of the primary catalysts, indeed, that led to the Civil War, a war which eventually brought about the end of slavery. After the Civil War, Ashley and his colleagues amended the Constitution to end slavery and establish equality rights in what's known as the Reconstruction era. As Dean McHenry mentioned earlier, they enacted the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude and established positive rights to free labor. The 14th Amendment, recognizing rights that are enforceable against state governments, including due process and equal protection of the laws. And the 15th Amendment, prohibiting states from denying the right to vote based on race. All of these measures contain congressional enforcement clauses, empowering Congress for the first time to protect equality rights. These clauses gave Congress the power to define and protect rights, and the enforcement power was intended to be broad. They create an enduring obligation for Congress to protect equality rights and are also embodied in all of the constitutional amendments which expand equality rights, including, for example, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. These congressional enforcement clauses embed popular constitutionalism into the Constitution, popular movements articulating rights claims in constitutional terms and calling on Congress to embrace those claims when legislating to define and protect those rights. The Reconstruction Amendments thus constitutionalized the rights claims developed by anti-slavery activists. And the Reconstruction Congress enacted legislation to protect those rights that are still good law today, including the 1866 Civil Rights Act, protecting against race discrimination in contracts and providing that all persons, including freed slaves, were entitled to the full and equal benefit of all laws. The Anti-Peonage Act, which prohibited peonage and other involuntary servitude. The enforcement acts, including 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, the font of civil rights litigation, which makes federal rights enforceable against state governments. Tragically, after the end of Reconstruction, the federal government backed away from enforcing the rights of freed slaves, and southern states adopted the racist Jim Crow system. During the early 20th century, the most effective rights, they were in there. Those statutes I just mentioned. During the early 20th century, the most effective rights movement in this country was the labor movement. Leaders articulated their free labor tradition, rooted in the Free Soil movement, and argued that they had a constitutional right to organize into unions, bargain, and collectively, and to strike. They also advocated for material rights of workers, including minimum wage, maximum hours legislation. Millions of workers engaged in strikes and other public demonstrations in order to enforce these rights. They suffered violence and economic hardship. And during the New Deal, Congress invoked labor's struggles and vision when enacting legislation protecting workers' rights and creating an economic safety net, including the National Labor Relations Act, which protects the right to organize into unions, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which establishes a minimum wage and restrictions on working hours, and the Social Security Act, which established a safety net, an economic safety net, including Social Security in our country. Organized labor played a major role in expanding equality rights in this country, and all rights. Workers' rights, including the right to organize, but also a minimum wage and maximum hours. Civil liberties by raising free speech and free assembly claims in the interwar era, and also civil rights. Now, it's true that labor unions' history is decidedly mixed on race. Many unions discriminated on the basis of race. But other unions engaged in the cause of racial equality, especially the Congress and Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, which was created in the 1930s and demanded racial equality and an end to racial violence. And some union leaders became civil rights leaders. Foremost among them, A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Pullman Porters Union and civil rights advocate, who became a mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King, and who, alongside United Auto Workers President Walter Reuther, helped to organize the 1963 March on Washington, where King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Which brings us back to Dr. King. As you can see, Dr. King was acting in a great tradition of civil disobedience and political activism on behalf of equality rights. Dr. King and other civil rights activists literally risked their lives as we know, Dr. King sacrificed his life, as they advocated for the end of segregation and for the right to vote. Dr. King also advocated for economic rights, pointing out the link between race and poverty in our country that dates back to the days of slavery. This advocacy included the Montgomery bus boycott, which began when Rosa Parks refused to go to sit down in the back of the bus, and turned into a citywide boycott of the city buses, which lasted for months and ended up in desegregating the Montgomery buses. And there was the Montgomery bus boycott, which brought Dr. King to the civil rights leadership stage as he was called in and got involved in the organization. Other activists seized on this idea of desegregating public transportation and engaged in freedom rides, where they would get on the buses in Washington, D.C. that went into the South, refused to use segregated facilities, and the freedom riders, extremely courageous, encountered, one of their buses was bombed, extreme violence. Voter registration drives and political mobilization, including the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer, backed up by Dr. King's mass demonstrations, including the March on Washington, and here pictured the march in Selma, Alabama. At the end of his life, Dr. King turned his focus to Northern segregation and the fight against poverty, as well as opposition to the Vietnam War. These are just some examples of what Dr. King did as he dedicated his entire life, body, and soul to the cause of equality. And one thing I wanted to mention that Dean Jefferson mentioned, the meetings. The hours and hours and thousands and probably millions of hours that Dr. King spent in meetings, working with local activists throughout the country in trying to figure out the best strategy for addressing the problems he was addressing at the time. So last night, I read the speech that Dr. King gave in Memphis the night before he died. And you read the speech, there are some beautiful soaring phrases, but most of his speech is talking about practically what are we going to do to help these striking sanitation workers to be recognized as a union and to bargain for a livable wage. He talked about economic boycotts. He talked about certain products that people should not drink Coca-Cola because the Coca-Cola company discriminated. But people should patronize Black-owned businesses, including a local insurance company. Talking about these basic, these kind of nitty-gritty, not quite as sexy type of activism, which was so much of what Dr. King's life was. And there's some wonderful biographies written of him, and I urge you to read them, including by Taylor Branch, and you will see hours and hours, as Dean Jefferson mentioned. It is in large part to Dr. King's leadership that historians refer to the 1960s as the Second Reconstruction. Dr. King and the civil rights advocates fought to fulfill the promise, as Dean mentioned, that James Ashley and his colleagues had made a century before. And they achieved many victories in the political process. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits race discrimination in employment, education, and privately owned places of public accommodation. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, probably the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever, including effective mechanisms for enforcing the 15th Amendment and protecting the right to vote. The 1968 Fair Housing Act, directed at northern ghettos, responding tragically to violence after Dr. King's assassination in northern cities, prohibiting race discrimination in all real estate transactions, and Great Society programs expanding the safety net to include healthcare programs, including Medicare and Medicaid. Inspired by the civil rights movement of Dr. King, other rights movements asserted themselves in the 1970s and beyond, including the women's rights movement, disability rights movement, gay rights movement, and all of their struggles continue. Supporters of these rights movement brought lawsuits to enforce constitutional rights, but they also engaged in political action. They had learned that something special happens when legislatures act to protect those rights, the national community opening itself up to include outsiders. But this will never happen unless supporters of equality rights engage in political action. All of these movements invoke the Constitution or constitutional values, which form a strong moral and ideological core of their activism. As Professor Mari Matsuda says, an Asian American professor a law professor, says, "The Constitution is not mine, but I can make it my own." And that's what these activists have sought to do from the early anti-slavery constitutionalists through today. Sadly, however, recent events in our country reveal that now has never been more fiercely urgent. What equality rights are most pressing today? Well, we could spend hours and hours debating that, but I have a couple of ideas. One is the problem of mass incarceration of people of color throughout our country, which is a direct legacy of slavery in the Jim Crow system. We can bring legislation to try to change some of the discriminatory laws, which are litigation, to try to change some of the discriminatory laws which are being enforced. But we can also engage in systemic reform. And I'm very happy that Vermont Law School this year is starting under the leadership of Professor Sand, a Restorative Justice Institute, which is designed to reform our criminal justice system and address the problem of mass incarceration. Another example is the cause of low-wage workers. Raise the minimum wage. Never forget that Dr. King was in Memphis at the end of his life to support striking low-wage workers, the sanitation workers of the city of Memphis. At the end of his life, Dr. King was most concerned about economic rights, including the rights of workers, and he was engaged in the poor people's movement. People of color in this country are still disproportionately likely to be poor. To fight this, we need to resort to advocacy for economic rights as well as protections from race discrimination. These are only a couple of examples, but whatever cause you choose, remember the lesson of Dr. King's first fierce urgency of now. As lawyers and law students, we understand the value of litigation for asserting claims of rights. But when it comes to equality rights, litigation is no substitute for political action. Thank you. Dean Jefferson says I can answer a few questions if anybody has questions or comments. Yes.
I do have a comment. So we heard two beautiful songs about water. I just wanted to remind you that our water is still dirty. Ask the children in Flint, they will tell you that water is still dirty.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And also wanted to remind you that, our water is still bloody. So we have a mission to be drummers for justice. And that mission was passed on to us. So I'm asking you to be drummers for justice until justice rolls down like waters, until righteousness streams like a mighty stream. Dear friends, sometimes we don't know what to do. We are worried. We are not worried so much of what others, the enemies, do, or the power of their loudness, but our concern is about the silence of our allies. Sometimes we don't know what to do, so I have two suggestions. If you don't know what to do, donate $5 to those causes that you feel are advocating for African Americans or any race. If you see a post on Facebook of your friend trying to do something for any cause, don't just scroll down without liking it. By doing that, your friend will know that he or she is not alone. That's all I want to say.
Thank you.
Oh, you have a hand over there.
Oh, yes.
Not a high school kid. Professor Zitlow, 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States. I wonder if you have any comments about the exception clause and whether there have been any efforts to eliminate that so that there would be a blanket prohibition on slavery.
Well, this exception clause is something that has gotten a lot of attention since the documentary 13th. As a historian, I can tell you that there are some historians working on this. Most people seem to take for granted that the exceptions clause creates an exception to the prohibition against slavery. If you've committed a crime and you're duly convicted, you can be enslaved. But I am certain that that is not true, that is not a proper interpretation of the 13th Amendment. There are people out, activists working on this now, as well as scholars, and you will hear more from us. Yes, Professor Latham.
If I could, I'd like to thank Dean Jefferson for all her hard work in putting this together, as well as Balsa. Thank you. And I never will forget when I first started at Vermont Law School, my very first King Day celebration. I had class afterwards. So I bumped into Shirley and she said, "Are you going?" And I said, "No, I got to get ready for class." And she gave me this look where I knew immediately I gave the wrong answer. So I attended and I haven't missed one since, so thank you. And thanks to Balsa. Professor Zitlow, thank you for your comments. What should we do in light of the current administration on the issues that King so eloquently stood for? When we face a moment in history where the Klan is back marching, as we've seen, and the president is rather sympathetic towards this, and thought there were good people on both sides, as he put it. So what do we do about this at this time?
Well, I think what's important is the gentleman over here mentioned, not to get too distracted by debates over, who said what, or whether the president used a racist term or just was, expressed racist sentiments, and focus in on what matters and organizing about issues that we care about. One of the things, what's happening while there's all this noise and drama? One example is the declining protection for workers. Legislatures and states are enacting legislation which is going to further restrict the union rights of public workers. The Department of Justice under the Trump regime is not going to enforce equality rights at all. We can't expect them, they're not going to. And so we need to do that ourselves, right? So I think what we need to do is to continue to work and not get too distracted by, I think, distractions that are intended to distract us. But we can't take for granted some things that we might have taken for granted before, that there was, for example, a universal condemnation of racism. In fact, I was looking at an earlier version of a speech that I gave kind of like this, where I said, well, we've all sort of agree as a national consensus that racism is bad. I'm not sure if I don't think we can take that for granted anymore. But I think that means that we have to be more assertive about our condemnation of racism and working together. And I think I'm going to go back to what Dean Jefferson said. I think it's very important to engage on social media, and that is what we do. But there's no substitute for actually getting in a room and planning with our bodies and getting out on the streets with our bodies. Yes.
I was in Birmingham, Alabama, in high school when Dr. King was there. I was about 4 miles when the little girls were bombed, so I was there. I have experienced all of this, and
I'm sorry for the interruption.
it's very hard for me because I came out of all of this. But to me, Trump has been the best thing for Black people. And I say that because before he got started, we thought racism was over with. If you mention racism, there is no racism. People would actually get angry with you. And when he started to talk, all these people came out with money. They bagged him. They're in Congress now. They're not saying anything. They don't remember what he said. So he has pulled the rag off of the bush. And for me, that was a good thing, because if we are lying about something and we won't call it what it is, and if the whole country says that there is something wrong with me because I said I'd been discriminated against, and he's put it out there. And we're looking at Congress, because to me, Trump should have been shut down a long time ago. But it just keeps rolling. I look at CNN, I can't hardly stop watching CNN for some reason, because I look and I listen, and it's a lot of talk going on, but there's no action. So I do believe when he's done, it's going to be 1,000,000 times better. I believe that. I think that, and I don't think it's going to be too much longer. But this is just my opinion about what I feel that is going on. But I'd like to say to all of the students here, I'm very proud of you. But to the black students, and I'm not being discriminatory, but when I look at them and I remember me when I was their age and the opportunities that I had, that they have, that I did not have. And I want you to value those things, because you couldn't always do it. You couldn't always be and go and see. And we had, I'm just proud. I am very, very proud. I am 70 years old, and I'm sitting in Vermont Law School with my 2 daughters. Yay. My grandmother could not have dreamed of that. I am thankful, I am blessed, and I wish all of you well.
Tell us who you are.
Oh, I'm Jacqueline Dawkins, and I'm from Alabama. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, okay.
Got a question for one more.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi there. So my American history is a little bit rusty, so you'll have to forgive me on that. But I believe I remember Reconstruction era, there being some talk about reparations, and never occurred. And I wonder, when you discuss the economic front of discrimination in the 21st century, maybe we're looking at a historical cost of that decision. And I just wonder if that's a conversation that ever comes up in modern times. Thank you.
Yes, I was just talking with my daughter about this very issue on the way up here. If there were some who supported land reform, who supported the 40 acres and a mule, and that would be a way to compensate slaves, and also to provide them with a source of livelihood so they wouldn't have to depend on getting jobs from their former masters, which is what ended up happening, right? So if there had been that type of reparations then, Reconstruction probably would have been a lot more successful. We are living the consequences of the fact that Reconstruction was incomplete and short in duration, and that after the Northern troops pulled out of the South, after the federal troops pulled out of the Southern states in 1876, things reverted very much back to slave days. In fact, really, many people were enslaved, many through the convict labor system. And so I think that if there were economic reparations, then maybe it would have been different. This is something we were debating. Or maybe there just would have been even more violence as the Southern landowners seized the land back from people that had been given it, during Reconstruction. I'm kind of pessimistic, I have to say, when I think about that. There has been a movement thinking about reparations for descendants of slaves. It was, as you may know, in the early 1980s, Congress did enact a law providing reparations for Japanese Americans who were imprisoned during World War II and lost, their farms, their businesses, and all that. And so around that time, especially, there was some talk that we should do this for the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of former slaves. But it's never really gotten off the ground. And part of it is the difficulty, the complexity of trying to figure out how to administer such a reparations system, right? But it's a good question, and I really, over the years, become more and more convinced that the economics are the key to the problem. That slavery was about the use of racial subordination to exploit workers. So was Jim Crow. So was the convict labor system. So are the treatment of migrant workers today, most of whom are people of color, the ones that are undocumented and have no rights. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Don't leave yet. Cynthia's gonna come up and bring you a little gift.
So on the behalf of BALSA, the Black Law Student Association, and VLS, we would like to thank you and give you a little gift for reminding us that we still have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna close pretty soon, but I just want to say a few things. I want to say thank you to Vermont Law School, and I'd like to thank our new dean. This has been my 18th year here at the law school, and we've been planning these events since I've been here. Kenvin Roth, former dean, you know how long they've been celebrating the annual Dr. Martin Luther King here? Oh my goodness. I would say it's been a while, and I just think that it's very important that we continue to do this. And we've been inviting you all down here from the high school from day one. And I hope today that you all got a great history lesson. And thank you, Professor Zitlow, that I'm a history major and I was in heaven today. I love history. I just don't want history to repeat itself. I think that's why it's important. And I think Professor Barry in your class on 13, and you're teaching the class. Yes, and so thank you. So we got a lot going on here. Professor Sands, new program. We're doing a lot. We might be a little small law school in a little rural area here, but we're doing great things. And we are grooming the next generation, the next leaders of lawyers, including your high school kids. So without further delay, I know you all have to go back to school, and I know some of you have to go to class. Some of us have to go back to work. Let's stand, and we're going to sing We Shall Overcome. We Shall Overcome is the song that we used to sing. And why don't the choir come on up? I call it the choir. At the end of all of the mass meetings, we would cross hands. Look, crisscross your hand. You got to do it this way. Yep. Crisscross your hand. There you go. Okay, Rashida, put down those cell phones. And I see you all in the back. Crisscross those hands. It's important. Upstairs. Come on upstairs. There you go. Okay. All right. Come on. Here we go.